So many modern pagans, especially newer ones, tend to see the trickster god as just a mythology's class clown, the mischievous troublemaker who lies, cheats and causes chaos for fun. A funny, chaotic personality, a prankster god who causes trouble and makes for entertaining stories or TV characters. But what if that joker of the gods was actually one of the most important figures in the entire Indo-European pagan mythological worldview? In this video, you'll discover why nearly every Indo-European pagan tradition, from the Norse stories of Loki to the Greek myths of Hermes and Prometheus, preserved a trickster figure, and what deep role that character played in how ancient people understood change, creativity, and the evolution of order itself. We'll explore what the trickster actually represents, why these stories are far more than comic relief, and how this strange character embodies a powerful idea that progress often begins with a breach of the rules. The trickster was obviously never merely cosmic relief. He was a catalyst, a force that challenged order, crossed boundaries, and pushed the world forward in ways that other gods could not. And once you start looking across the different Indo-European mythologies, you quickly notice that this figure appears again and again. In the Norse stories, Loki constantly disrupts the world of the gods, sometimes creating disasters, sometimes solving problems that no one else can fix. In Greek mythology, Hermes begins his life by stealing Apollo's cattle, lying about it, and then inventing the lyre in the process. Prometheus deceives the gods and steals fire for humanity, forever changing the human condition. Different cultures, different names, but the pattern is remarkably similar. These figures lie, steal, mock authority, they break rules and cross boundaries that other gods respect. Sometimes they help the gods, sometimes they cause catastrophe. Often they do both in the same story. At first glance, it all seems like chaotic mischief, entertaining stories about divine troublemakers. But if we look a little closer, we start to see that these myths aren't really about jokes or pranks at all. They are about something much deeper. Because when we step back and look at the role the trickster actually plays in these mythologies, we begin to see that this strange character represents something fundamental about how ancient Indo-European cultures understood change, creativity, and the very way the world develops. The best place to start to fully understand the true role and function of the trickster is the broader Indo-European worldview, the way these cultures understood the structure of the universe itself. Across these traditions, we find the same basic cosmological image, the universe as a living structure centered around an axis mundi, a world pillar that connects the different levels of existence, the world tree. In the Norse sources, for example, the text Gylfaginning describes the immense world tree Yggdrasil, whose branches stretch across the heavens while its roots extend deep into the other realms. At the base of the tree, the gods hold court, that's to say, establish and maintain cosmic order. But the tree is only half of the picture. At its base lies a well, a deep source of primordial waters. The tree rises upward as the ordered structure of the cosmos, while the well descends downward into the depths of chaos. In Indo-European cosmological thinking, the tree represents the structured order of the universe, the pattern framework of reality itself. The branches and roots form the living architecture of the cosmos, the structured order through which the world exists and functions. While the waters of the well, on the other hand, they represent chaos, not simply destruction, but the raw, unformed potential from which new things can emerge. And these two are not enemies, they feed each other. The water of the well nourishes the roots of the tree. From that water, the tree grows, branching outward into the ordered cosmos. But the tree also produces fruits, seeds that fall back down into the well. And those seeds enter the waters of chaos, where they are transformed, dissolved and renewed before eventually feeding the tree again. So the cycle continues. Chaos feeds cosmos and cosmos feeds chaos. One can't be without the other. If only one existed, there would be no movement, no expansion at all. But order is by nature static. By itself, it would become rigid and lifeless. A perfectly fixed cosmos would be like a crystal, flawless but brittle, incapable of adapting and doomed to shatter at the slightest disturbance. The cosmos itself would never allow a standstill and stalemate. The constant influx of chaos prevents that from happening. It renews the structure of the world, allowing new forms and possibilities to emerge. But chaos is also dangerous. Too much of it would overwhelm the structure entirely. So the universe exists in a delicate balance, a constant circulation between order and disruption, between structure and transformation. We see this very clearly in the battle between the two seasons, summer and winter, so common among pagans. We see it in their division between pasture time contra hunting time. And we, of course, see it when the Germanic gods battle the Jötnar, that's to say, the chaotic forces of cosmos and nature. We see it when the Vedic Devas battle the Asuras. We see it in the Gigantomachy and the Titanomachy, the epic battles between Olympian gods versus titans and earth-born giants, where external chaotic forces try to overthrow established order. And so new layers are added on to cosmology and existence. Things are in constant change. You cannot step down into the same river twice, as the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus said. For things to evolve, for something new to arise, something else has to die and decay to create new energy. The forces of cosmos and nature are constantly in a battle-ready standoff. But for there to be effect, there also needs to be cause. There needs to be a spark, a trigger, an X factor. And it is precisely within this kind of dynamic relationship that the trickster finds his place. From here, we can begin to explore the deeper functions and roles the trickster serves in this system. First of all, it's important to emphasize this central idea once more. The trickster represents the element of chaos that is necessary for change. In the Indo-European worldview, order alone cannot create movement. A perfectly ordered system becomes static, rigid, predictable, and ultimately lifeless. But chaos alone, on the other hand, is purely volatile and destructive. Without structure, it cannot create anything lasting. But when the two interact, something new becomes possible. Creative change emerges from the tension between order and disruption. For there to be an effect, there must first be a cause, some force that disturbs the existing structure and sets events into motion. In mythological language, this force often appears in the form of the trickster. Through deception, rule breaking, and boundary crossing, the trickster introduces precisely the disturbance that allows the world to move forward. The stories may describe thefts, pranks, or acts of defiance, but their deeper meaning is that transformation begins with a breach in the established order. In other words, the trickster dramatizes a fundamental insight that the world does not evolve through perfect stability, but through small disruptions that force the structure of reality to adapt and renew itself. Another very ancient theme that helps us understand the role of the trickster is the Indo-European myth of cattle theft. Across basically all the Indo-European traditions, we find remarkably similar stories about cattle being stolen or hidden or carried away. These stories appear in different forms in Greek mythology, in the Vedic tradition. They likely trace all the way back to a shared Proto-Indo-European myth. So to understand why this mattered so much, we need to remember that cattle, what that cattle represents in European cultures. They were largely pastoral societies, and cattle symbolized far more than simple livestock. They represented stability, wealth, fertility, and the ordered structure of the community itself. The pastoral world, herds, land, kinship, and domestic life, stood for a stable and structured cosmos. In this symbolic language, cattle came to represent cosmic order itself. So when a myth tells us that cattle are stolen, hidden, or disrupted, the story isn't merely about animals being taken from a field. It's about a disturbance in the very structure or the very order. One famous example appears in Greek mythology. As a newborn, Hermes steals the castle of Apollo. Apollo represents divine order, harmony, and reason, the very principles that structure the world. And Hermes deceives him, hides the tracks of the animals, and denies the theft. Yet, from this conflict, something new emerges. Hermes finally invents the lyre, that's to say, song and poetry, another crucial pillar in Indo-European paganism. And the two gods ultimately reach a new balance. The story is playful on the surface, but its symbolism runs really deep. The trickster disrupts order, yet that disruption leads to the creation of something new that becomes part of the new cosmic harmony. So another layer. In the original Proto-Indo-European myth, it is a three-headed serpent who steals the cattle. A terrible crime, of course, but in doing so, and when the hero Trito has recovered cattle and given them back to the priests to be properly sacrificed, a new thing is invented and established, the cycle of reciprocity or mutual giving between gods and mortals. And similar patterns appear in Vedic mythology, where cattle are stolen or hidden and must be recovered, and in other Indo-European traditions where the theft of cattle represents a crisis in the structure of the world that must be resolved. And once again, we see the same pattern. The trickster interferes with the symbols of stability and order, creating a rupture in the established structure that's been going on for a long time. But through that rupture, transformation and improvement becomes possible. The myth of cattle theft therefore dramatizes the same fundamental principle we discussed earlier, that order alone cannot generate change. It takes disruption, a breach, to set the process of renewal into motion. And speaking of stealing, we see this same pattern very clearly in the myths surrounding the Norse trickster Loki. Loki's stories are filled with acts of theft, sabotage and disruption. At first glance, these episodes can seem like nothing more than mischief. But when we look at them symbolically, they reveal the same deeper pattern we have already been discussing. One famous example is when Loki cuts off the golden hair of Sif, the wife of Thor. In the symbolic language of the myths, Sif's hair, of course, represents ripened grain, the harvest, fertility, and the life that sustains the community. And by cutting it off, Loki creates a breach in the natural order and life itself. But the story doesn't end there. In order to repair the damage he has caused, Loki travels to the dwarves and persuades them to craft new treasures for the gods. Among these are some of the most powerful objects in Norse mythology. For example, better magical hair for Sif, that's to say fortified and enriched grains, so better living. Thor's hammer, Odin's spear, Gungnir. What began as an act of destructive mischief ultimately results in the creation of even greater sacred treasures. And we see the same pattern in another myth when Loki's schemes lead to the abduction of Idun, the keeper of the apples of immortality. Without her apples, the gods begin to age and weaken. Another symbol of that layer on layer. So that's a direct threat to the cosmic order. Yet Loki is also the one who ultimately retrieves her, restoring balance to the world. Loki's relationship to theft appears again and again. In some stories he steals or borrows Freya's falcon cloak, a magical garment that allows the wearer to move between worlds. Another breach and liminality. In another myth, he steals the magical gold and the cursed ring Andvaranaut from the dwarf Andvari, an act that sets in motion a chain of events affecting both gods and heroes. There's even the famous story of the necklace Brisingamen, associated with the goddess Freya. Loki steals the necklace, provoking a confrontation between Heimdall, that's to say the guardian of Asgard and divine order, and Loki themselves. Two forces that, in symbolic terms, often represent opposing principles within the cosmic order. Again and again, Loki creates disruption through theft, deception, or betrayal. But those disruptions rarely end in simple destruction. Instead, they force the world of the new gods to respond, adapt, and renew itself. What Loki takes away is often replaced with something even greater. And once again, we see the same underlying idea that the trickster introduces the breach that makes transformation and improvement possible. And speaking of setting events in motion, another key function of the trickster is that he often acts as the catalyst for the most important events in mythology. Time and again, the trickster is the one who triggers the stories that reshape the world. Without his actions, many of the great turning points in myth would never occur. In Norse mythology, Loki's actions break the peace and order of the gods, triggering the apocalyptic winter, and he ultimately becomes one of the central figures behind Ragnarök, the catastrophic battle that brings about the end of the old cosmic order and starting a new chapter. Yet Ragnarök is not simply destruction, it's also renewal. After the old world collapses, a new one rises from the sea, purified and reborn. The cycle begins again on a higher level. In other words, even this seemingly apocalyptic event follows the same pattern we've been discussing: disruption leading to transformation and evolution. This pattern also appears across many other Indo-European traditions. In Greek mythology, Prometheus' theft of fire from the gods permanently alters the human condition, bringing knowledge, culture, technology, and civilization into the world. Zeus swallows his first wife, the Titan Metis, after hearing a prophecy that she would bear a child who might overthrow him. You see the same pattern, taking something away and starting something new. The Titans obviously represent an older layer of divinity and order. Metis' name literally means cunning intelligence, strategic thinking, and adaptive wisdom. And by swallowing her, Zeus prevents the prophecy, but something unexpected happens. Metis continues to live inside him, and her wisdom becomes part of him. Eventually, their daughter Athena is born from Zeus' head. So instead of only removing and replacing the old and Metis, the past and an old structure, Zeus internalizes her power and integrates it into the contemporary and the future. What these myths share is the idea that major transformations rarely occur on their own. Something has to disturb the existing balance. Someone has to initiate the process. And again, that role falls to the trickster. He is the one who starts the chain reaction, the spark that sets events into motion and forces the cosmos to evolve beyond its current state. And here we inevitably come to the deeper conclusion that lies behind all of these stories. When we step back and look at the trickster across the Indo-European mythology as a whole, what emerges is not merely a mischievous character or a convenient plot device. What emerges is something much more profound. The trickster is, in many ways, evolution personified. Remember that. Evolution personified. Trickster stories tend to follow the same pattern again and again. First, a stable order exists. Then the trickster violates a rule, breaks a taboo, or disrupts the structure in some way. Chaos or crisis follows, but out of that crisis, a new and more complex order eventually emerges. In the short term, the trickster's actions appear destructive, but in the long term, they become generative. Just like that nature isn't good or evil, it's neutral. Some scholars describe this as creative transgression, the idea that new forms can only emerge when existing structures are challenged or broken. And when we look at these myths through that lens, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Prometheus steals fire and transforms the human condition. Hermes disrupts Apollo's order, but invents music and poetry in the lyre in that process, so important to paganism. Loki creates crises among the gods, yet those crises repeatedly result in new treasures, new powers, or new arrangements within the cosmos. The breach creates the possibility for transformation. And this also mirrors the way real cultures evolve. Many innovations in human history have required someone to step outside accepted norms, to violate tradition, experiment, take risks, and try something that had never been done before. In mythic language, the trickster dramatizes this very process. More modern interpretations have even compared trickster behavior to the logic of mutation in evolutionary systems. In biological evolution, most mutations are neutral or harmful, but occasionally one produces a new advantage that allows life to develop in a new direction. Tricksters behave in a strikingly similar way. They introduce disruptions into the system, many of which are chaotic or dangerous, but some of which create entirely new possibilities. And in this sense, the trickster represents variation, the unpredictable element that makes development possible. The anthropologist Victor Turner described figures like the trickster as embodiments of what he called anti-structure, the forces of spontaneity, experimentation, and unpredictability that challenged established hierarchy and stability. And without such forces, systems become rigid and incapable of adapting. Myth, in this way, reflects a deep intuition about how living systems actually work. Order alone cannot evolve. Chaos alone cannot sustain anything. But when the two interact, when structure encounters disruption, new forms can emerge. And that is precisely where the trickster lives. He is a liminal character who stands at the boundary between chaos and cosmos, between stability and change, something new. He is the disturbance that sets events in motion, the breach that forces the structure of the world to adapt, the unpredictable force through which the future enters the present. In other words, the trickster embodies a profound insight encoded in myth long before modern science would describe it in evolutionary terms. Systems evolve through disruptive variation. The trickster is that disruption made visible, the mythological expression of the principle that development, innovation, and renewal require the breaking of old forms. Without the trickster, the cosmos would remain perfectly ordered and perfectly still. Nothing would grow, improve, or evolve. And this is remarkably similar to how evolution works in the natural world. Evolution rarely proceeds through calm stability. It is usually triggered by disruption, changes in environment, pressure on existing systems, or unexpected variations that challenge the old way of doing things. At first, these disruptions can appear harmful, chaotic, or painful, and maybe they are. They introduce instability into systems that previously seemed secure. But precisely because of that pressure, adaptation begins. New solutions emerge, structures reorganize themselves. What once seemed like a crisis becomes the starting point for something stronger, more complex, and better suited to the new conditions. Evolution. In this sense, the trickster represents the moment when the old order is forced to change. He is the disturbance that pushes the system beyond its limits and compels it to evolve. The disruption may be uncomfortable, even frightening, but without it, growth would never occur. In this way, the trickster can also be understood as a symbol of the unknown future. Before he acts, the world is predictable and stable. After he acts, the system has changed in ways no one could fully foresee. The trickster therefore embodies the unpredictable creative force of the future and the nature and life, the element of reality that introduces novelty into the world and ensures that the story of the cosmos never truly really stands still. And all of this is, of course, perfectly normal and logical. After all, paganism isn't something else than cosmos, life, and nature itself. We're all pagan by instinct.